Go ahead, Faisal.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Faisal Hassan from 421, and welcome to the sixth public talk from our colloquium Screening Screaming. The colloquium and the curatorial development exhibition program are in partnership with the Bombay Institute for Critical Analysis and Research, BICAR. Tonight's talk is titled 21st Century Vernissage, and our speaker will be Heather Yeung, and the discussant for tonight's talk will be Lina Ramadan. Lina is a curator and a researcher and currently a PhD candidate in art theory and cultural studies at the Academy of Fine Arts, Vienna. And I will leave it to Lina to take the conversation from here. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Faisal. I would just want to quickly apologize for my flu voice, but I'm really looking forward to today's talk. I'll briefly introduce Heather, and who will give a presentation, and we will follow by a 5 minutes break, and we'll end it with a Q&A session. So please feel free to add your questions in the chat. And I also know that the talk is being streamed on YouTube, so feel free to also share your comments and questions over there. To introduce Heather Yeung, she's a poet, literary theorist, artist bookmaker, director of the literature training at the Scottish Graduate School for Arts and Humanities. And she teaches in poetry, poetics at the University of Dundee. She's the author of On Literary Plasticity and Spatial Engagement with Poetry, published in 2015, if I'm not mistaken. Large collections of her poetic and artist book works are held in the Scottish Poetry Library and National Library of Scotland. Without further ado, please, the floor is yours, Heather.
Thank you, Lina, for a so generous introduction. Yeah, none of the things that I seem to make sit easy on the tongue, not for myself or for anyone else. So I think that maybe is kind of a guiding principle of today's talk. I'll try not to trip over too much my tongue. So 21st Vernissage, or Nature's Scream, is the full title of the talk. And I'm super excited to be here again, but here differently, sort of presenting this time in this really wonderful series of BICAR Warehouse 421 talks, all of which take the problem or question, or the problem of the question of nature in absolute seriousness and in radically different ways. When I was redrafting this after thinking about the various talks so far, that kind of horrific conceptual time that elapses between vow or abstract given forth and the actualization of the gift or the talk. My brain, the brain, like so many chimeras bombinating in so many vacuums, sort of this sort of Rabelaisian effect of this always subtle question, or to digress even before we've begun, I suppose, as it's written in the second book, the seventh section of Gargantua and Pantagruel, questo subtilissimo utrum chimera in vacuo bombinans possit commodere secundas intentiones. These sort of chimeras affected a buzzing, noisy, layering, internally self-ironizing set of thoughts, where the structures of functional rhetorical irony allowed for a sort of flip side series of crack-ups through figure and illusion that eventually I just called it to a stop, particularly since the fantastical Monsieur Rabelais' optimistic nature positivism, or his way of configuring the fact of what nature may or might be in the manner of this ill-fittingness with his configuration of the figure of man and man's curiosities, killing perhaps those poor mythic chimeras in the process, offers us only a mild use alongside the apparent subject of this paper, not including, of course, the mimetic sonorousness of the vernissage's hissing link to the possible chimerical bombinatory noises. But nevertheless, this is a way in, it's our way in now I've digressed, although it is better perhaps for all of this to sit as the second intention, in this case to be hopefully forgotten, even in its function as accidental frame, than as the vacuum, screen, chimera, or nature proper. We have begun then in digression. But digression through a suite of likenings, which are instructive in many ways to the mode that this talk will take on. For what does a likening do? Let's just recall here for a moment poor dead Aristotle, who I would otherwise not zombify, in the Rhetoric, on the a function of metaphor as the process through which it is possible, of the giving names to nameless things from things kindred or similar in appearance. What does a likening do except to draw attention to these noisy seconds, or the noise of the making second, which is to say, rather, to draw attention to the process and its improprieties, if we assume the possibility of an inviolable, inherently unsplit singular as ground, or to draw attention to the naturally improper nature of our calling to account the very interrelation between the or any work and the work of nature, the noise or crack spacing which holds the tenor of vehicle and vehicle intention, or the process that provides for us the gloss, the varnish, the screen, the frame, the violet, inviolate process. A process always where forms of rupture and condensation expose their messy materialities. A process whose laboriousness before its condensation, its hidden labor, the hidden labor of metaphor itself, the meta, the shift, the dash, the movement of the obliviation of connection, whilst it remains made obvious by the materials it holds in tension and the materiality of its own dimensional force. There is nothing unintentional about these opening gambits. They're pile on pile of metaphor, each of which end logic may call to different assumptions given your own approach to the listening here, your own influences brought to bear in effect as assumptions, frames on the wieldiness or otherwise of this verbalized frame in itself. Nothing unintentional, because the weightedness of forms of inference, their interaction with how inference frames and how inference immaterializes the labor or work of the work, and yet, of course, how inference can loop back to be made seen is, and the possibility that the work of the work itself rests, or indeed may be founded in the interference, the varnish, the screen, that which helps us recognize the work as such, rather than as something else, its own internal as if, which externalizes itself, in the mode that this talk operates in, at least. An important preliminary recce to make. It is cognate with the different acknowledgements and unpackings of ideas of the relation of nature, its screen, and nature, its screen, to the processes we so inhuman nature, and inhumanized incorporative address, our complicities here attending to this, the processes we use to attempt to infer a series of relations and to frame with one attempts a certain accession to dynamism and to finish or varnish or end. Here, then, the talk begins with the finish, vernissage, the now, 21st century, and loops to define, redefine, or show what it sits in tension with, the possibility or concept of not the existential modern metaphysics of a scream of nature, rather what that very idea, can we call it after the infamous painting of Munch, a verbi visual tautology, or at least cliche by now, itself, and the appropriative principles of matter and form may give to force us back to the idea of a screen. For we are all enscreened now too. This, then, is the first call to attend to the relative impropriety, the relatively inappropriate nature of our current screening. The second screen for a talk concerned with the matter of the vernissage, the not easily visibilized finish of the work, or its framing, or its screen, or the habits. For many of us, simply encounter vernissage as a pre-party for a show, rather than a part of an artistic process, which nevertheless therefore becomes a part of that very process of finishing, that surround our sense of the nature or authenticity of the produced artwork in its medium of telling, which is to say the temporary medium of telling in the installation space. We make of these screens, those of us whom are sitting at a computer sort of this way around, the potential of a world, a landscape, through a long, both Western and Far Eastern history of horizontal dimensionality and its implication for forms. And for those with a telephone sort of held upwards, a self-impression or portrait, right? So landscape, portrait. We swallow these terms and perhaps consider less the naturalistic paradigm from a Western classical painting tradition that they draw from. We'll be drawn to consider them, even if only obliquely soon, or draw out from this and consider it, in fact, in your practice now, in that way that even the reading of the book reflects one or the other of these naturalistic modalities, mostly landscape for kids and sometimes art, mostly portrait, for monographs, for stories. We see our nature in screened and through the screens, even if it is opaque dimensions and their predicate modes. We, in screened, have muted any current screen. We can turn down this volume, my speaking volume, of course, change our light settings, add filters, choose our frames per second onto a cellular level. We temper and control this digital environment more or less at will, or as we will. The method then of argument, of shouting at the chimeras who bombinate in the void with which we have begun this talk. Oh, to digress again, that I had decided to talk instead about chimeras in relation to the question of nature, or the ways in which fantastic, unnatural, visibilized non-nature exists in a weird, askew pantheon, or bestiary that is perhaps more literal to us than the real, odd, invisible, fantastic of denatured formal principles we take to be first nature within art. However, quite the opposite, of course. The method of argument, what about? How do you argue with the self-interiorizing logic of metaphors, progress, and form? This is a metaphysics which we don't want to encounter now, I think, with its exegetic hermeneutic expository moves in themselves a form of intellectual denaturing is not what we will necessarily address, and certainly not how we will practice today. Rather, we'll approach the opening gambit, which is to say the title, rather than this digression, which has become something of another frame or screen, first through the act and art of extreme poetic material condensation, and then through a suite of further digressions or demonstrations of the provocation at hand, the question of how it has been possible, perhaps, to come to a 21st century where the crack-ups and vanished frames are nonetheless horribly present, if only we work at the idea of finishing and therefore perhaps reapproach, see through their see-through occlusions, what this naturalization move in the work of art really implies for the question of the finish or the frame or its screen. Which is to say, what this implies really for the question of the various variant relations of nature to art and art to nature, which I hope we've already all worked out is not as simple as that chiasmus, rather it's a horrific series of interpenetrations, obliviations, whose various lober processes, the work of the work, become invisibilized through effect. Is that, and so the take home and the kind of guiding principle is that it's often important to chart a slantwise approach. Which is to say, let us begin again, reframe, rescreen in a mode more condensed, poetic. We'll encounter this in its material form, immaterially, of course, on this screen through a handling reading. 21st Vernissage, 21st century Vernissage. So, what gives now as the weight of paint cracks your canvas insufficiently stretched, primed, trimmed, preened? Are you ready yet? Etc. And can only stand aghast. Apart from the process, watch a double crackle sum. Potters would cherish this crazed half-light was never so effective at tight-fisted illumination as now, although we all know a milder crackle may be accidental, a product perhaps of too fast cooling off, as it all cracks up. The months or years or tears, and of course it is possible to equate all this, the symbols show as elastic proportions, ratio, a difference in strain between sub and pictorial layers, to measure our crack up thus or similarly. Spisso. And From below comes the seismic shift. We're lucky it's not landscape, which can be caused only by too much crap piled up above your gaudy daubs, and perhaps drifting old age. And what to do? As I weep, you ignore, pound the floor, pace, brush over the cracks, crack brushes over your one good knee, crying out in pain, and for crap's sake, begin what happens next by stuffing the canvas with whatever you can find. And dirt, dead leaves, dust, the floor has never been so clean, crumbs, marzipan, cigarette ash, broken sherds of cups, dog hair, my hair, there was never a dog, spit, twice or more, broth, skin, it all goes in. And as a final joke, grand geste of a murder, you drag out the oldest tin of primer you can find and slap it on in full. An act of vernissage reverso, if you will, revenge best served with nary a pang, pure impentimento. And it is a white square. Taut masterpiece, pieces tight, not from many years of stretch, but my short hours of tension, your short hours of rage or sleep, a crackpot crackler or conservator's nightmare. And of course, sells for millions, a song, your white out midden or bleakest of mares, it's all sorts hanging out in between shades of white, just waiting, bleached of purpose, till it's time to go dirty, cracking up all over again. The first move of the work is to mobilize a sense of the material process and the invisible labor, support mechanisms, second voices that are ladled, as it were, into a thing that we later consider a work, part of a single corpus, and to question, in some ways, the whiteout of the mechanisms at play here, the ways that the art of the crack-up and its stagings are formed practically. The I and you, of course, sit in an uneasy relation. For this, it is worth approaching this work in a way through Linda Nochlin, through Silvia Federici. What we white out of a given context, what becomes usually seen as problematic biographical context, an extension of this sense, which I had hoped we might have time to take in here, but I'm looking at the clock, but which we may only obliquely get to, is the question of the relation of the biographical horror of pure aesthetics, or kind of nature force as the kind of origin point of the work of art in the life, and the bios graphical, the bent of all oikos aesthetic modes of attention, the equation of any of these under a strange logic of white equals light equals simultaneously discovery / oblivion. The second move of the work shows us numerous possible detours, which we will now go on to take. Each detour is a demonstration, effectively, that leads us towards being able to take a position on the idea of how to see 21st century vernissage, how to notice new screenings of nature, where we may not see the screen but respond to its effects, where nature can be the parade of the ego, can be the so-called natural world, can be the unnatural or denatured, and all of this indeed must be all of these things. We will take a series of detours and return to the work. Each detour frames the work. Each time the work is read, it frames the detour. All aspects are held in tension with each other. To signpost, though, in contradistinction to the ideal of detour as potential talk process, to signpost our material explorations or poetic justifications, our subtle questions. But do we ask the chimera or the vacuum or the poet? First, we'll engage with the problem of white square. Second, with finish. And third, with the question of form and screen as crack spacing and its relation to the question of nature and the new screen, the vanished frame, the shift from perspective mediated by pigment to light. So it is a white square. We will observe 3 squares in series now. All squares are in their material form or performance of their materiality between 70 and 80 centimeters across. It's impossible to kind of mime that, but where we are not in the presence of their material form, which is all of us now, this means we can pull and push the image as we wish along a single mode of its dimension through this front-on viewing of the screen that we're positioned with now. Oh, a square. Absolutely not calling to or stuck between the very classical naturalistic modes of portrait, the implication that the contents of the frame will be somehow interrogating or reproducing ideas or ideals regarding the state of human nature, or landscape, which is to say the representational or interrogative mode regarding non-human or natural world, environment, or nature. Or for us now also a visual rhetoric which contains the perfectly Instagrammable dimensions of the square. Right? Neither human nor non-human nature, or maybe both and neither, the square. The compromise, which is also a critique of our associations of any dimensionality with any given form, the framing impulse really counts. But before we get to the squares in question, we'll begin with the white that is the first thing in the question, the vernissage. Lead-based white. One of the oldest pigments, recognizable almost on sight for its texture, its strange untimeliness in relation to other pigments, obvious in older, unrestored, but even restored works. Its material collaboration with oil means that it can relatively easily withstand darkening. It binds well with other colors. It holds well, therefore, in tension in both dimensions the canvas offers. Its relative excellence of plasticity, in part because of its unusual constituent parts, metallic. It holds well then, and where it may hold, it also leaches on a chemical level, lead, into its environment. Beware, then, the question of white in art, even before we come to think through its metapoetic registers. And hold in your head here, we'll come back to it, I hope. Just for one moment, Stéphane Mallarmé's infamous injunction of the blancs, the white spaces, the blank spaces that signify. To look at the relation of lead white to the idea of vernissage, it's appropriate perhaps to begin with one of the most important Western artists of the vernissage. Also perhaps, but this is a different paper, this is an artist of a new kind of formalism, not quite impressionism, who made it clear made very clear the idea of process as essential to nature in art. He's, of course, betimes a site-specific artist, so it follows that his attention to vernissage as act and as social gathering would be one which also involves the stage performance of the labor of the artist at work, and therefore the performance of the work of the work. And this is Joseph Mallard William Turner. Square. So we begin again, not now, but in the beginning throes of the 19th century. Turner is first instructive for his use of flake white in the vernissage or finishing process. He's also instructive for, as I've just mentioned, the staging of the nature of the artworks being made and the bringing of nature, which is really to say the creatively curated character of the artist as articulate maker and taker up of space into the space of the exhibition. And for, on all levels, the layering effects, anachronic in the extreme, particularly due to the materials used in their metapoetic registers, which add to the tension of the work and its force within his works, which perpetually stage and screen, the question of the possibility of the articulation of nature. The work I'd like us to attend to is, and you see it in screen form here, is Light and Color, Goethe's Theory, the Morning After the Deluge, Moses Writing the Book of Genesis, which full title I'm massively enjoying. And first, to visibilizing an aspect of process. This is one of a series of works of the late 30s and 40s, including the famous Fighting Temeraire, a series of paintings of Venice, and the reworked Regulars, which Turner finished in the same vigorous manner. They're all distinctively finished. And this finish is additionally distinctive due to its dimensionality, which is the point that I hope to bring out now. The white vernissage effects of Turner must be read into the work as cognate with the speed of application of paint in his work more generally. So even though this is absolutely not and makes no pretense to be an art history lecture, let's draw on some evidence. Edith May Fawkes's memory of Turner, seeing Turner work, attests to the dynamism of the process. He tore, he scratched, he scrubbed, as she writes. Joyce Townsend notes the material remainders, reminders as reminders in the paintings themselves. Brush hairs are still there. There is strong evidence of paint worked by the ends of brushes, by fingers and by fingernails. Think now of what these images are then, what they present as well as represent, how they represent what they present. The very surface of the image is being worked upon, and this is significant because it is this surface which holds then the question of the vernissage of the white. John Gilbert writes on observing Turner in one of his natural-born artist performances at the British Institution that he was absorbed in his work, did not look about him, but kept scumbling a lot of white into his picture, nearly all over it. He had a large palette, nothing on it but a huge lump of flake white. He had 2 or 3 biggish hog tools to work with, and with these he was driving the white into all the hollows and every part of the surface. This was the only work he did, and it was the finishing stroke. The picture gradually became wonderfully effective and throwing a misty haze over every object. Standing sideways at the canvas, I saw that the sun was a lump of white standing out like the boss on a shield. White gets rid of and makes anew the surface and the surface effects, lead white. This is Turner's version in this period of his painting, at least, of the painting's work. For such work, the screen to nature that shows nature as screen seems necessary. This sentence, of course, can be recast and art substituted for nature. There are lots of sentences in this talk where that kind of double formulation takes place. Because what we are addressing here in terms of Turner is the finish, the effect of the choice of an ultimate dynamic dimensionality of a subject's frame, its frontways as well as its sideways in framing. So the square does something, and then the depth does something. Its frame and its finish as the same thing. The work becomes work because it has a twofold movement of paint across it. First, the painting, second, the finish. This creates a materialism in the work of art indifferent to the subject of representation, but essential to the dynamic representation of that subject. This is vernissage as nature's screening. The astringent materialism here, a stirring in paint that creates movement in painting. Through the movement of the paint, it's scumbling, filling force, the deflattening of the varnish or the screen in flake white. What is at the surface here is a white square, right? So a white square is put on top of the painting, a mimicry of our intent to look for anything in a painting, a mimicry of the romanticization of the idea of nature's veil, working in abrupt contradistinction to Constable's romantic, varnish, static logic of movement, in which the same stirring of nature in art occurs in the movement of chiaroscuro in the painting, rather than in the materials of the painting. Note that both painters are absolutely chiaroscuric, but one denatures the flat dimension of the artwork to draw attention to its materials. Our first white square, then, is light and color, Goethe's theory, the morning after the deluge, Moses writing the book of Genesis, or first white square, or square scumbled with white. The repre is not good in the dot cam, but it's the effect of layering rather than the immediate representation that's the desired effect here. We are faced with a work, square, which indicates its conceptual rather than classically naturalist ambitions. It is an essay, in a sense, or I would claim, because of its radical condensation, a visual poem of sorts. The square denaturalizes or calls to our attention the question of nature. The title, An accretion, anachronic vision, indicates to us a similar layering as the paint surface contains. The work must be read in some ways as an interrogation or essay on the idea of nature, or second nature, and a statement about the obfuscated second nature. Briefly, then, aspects of what is condensed backwards, and I'm sort of working through the title of the work, through the work. There is something more foundational, more critical here than the dully naive distinction after Rousseau, after Schiller, of the idea of nature and recuperation through the Christian fall and return. Here, Turner, in one of the tripoda aspects of the title, a quadripoda, Turner calls into question that dominant Western paradigm that indeed we still see haunt nature discourse today. Post-Edenic, of course, all is wrong, must be wrong, mea culpa, the cry of the romantic Anthropocene hero. Not so as the painting displays for us a different way, indicating that in all forms of fall, which articulate an impossible return to nature, and nature can stand in for any form of belief or unbelief, the second story is often forgotten, making a point of difference, of a different nature, and placing as one thing framed by the scumbling white surface work, the question of the deluge, the post-Edenic cleansing of the earth. We come back to the question of surface and nature, of a biblical sort of vernissage, kind of ironized and made material rather than liquid. After the deluge, this could be a commonplace, allowing the work to sit as an easy representation, which it is not, or is and is not only, but rather is loaded thick with the resonance also of the story of the flood from the Pentateuch, an old cleansing, which we can read multiply across different of the so-called monotheisms. So this particular deluge aftermath, in which on a phenomenal level, we must necessarily be brought to imagine a world in the beginning throes of its repopulation, still glistening with the patina of water residue, nature's screen, operates on a level of the representational and the symbolic. The two textures are inextricable and highly textured. Onto this cleansing. Think through the implications of this on the work whose dense materiality and oil-based medium are essential departures from the water matter represented, or critique of the nature utopian tabula rasa. One may call it after the genocide or after the great mass extinction also, if we take the Noah narrative seriously as symbolic and rewrite it for a now in which the force of water is shared. We may add the mosaic aspect. We have an aftermath, post-destruction, in which, if we follow the symbolic narrative, social labor is implied. We also have a preface. Moses, Musa, preacher at Exodus, is shown here, and you can't see him here, but he's there. A Jerome-like shadow holding part of the white scumble deluge vortex, kind of like holding the tension. But which, and this then is a wonder of the anachronic nature of the work, is also a point of no return, a point where the question of work, of labor, and that of necessary departure, in this case, not from the deluge and also from the deluge, but also from slavery and not from the deluge, is indicated, in which moment also the narrative of the aftermath, which has come before, is written. And of course, by the time Turner is painting this, the mosaic idea of Genesis, kind of Genesis being writing, is sort of apocryphal, or at least highly questioned. So there are two of the parts of the title. And so Goethe. After water, after narrative inscription, two stories of symbolic fate culturally mobilized in different ways, even to this day, with different textures and different frames, different finishing points, different varnishes, comes material self-consciousness, which adds to the painting as essay or poem's anamnetic modality, exacerbated or mirrored by the finger marks, the brush parts, the scumble. Light and color, Goethe's theory. This, then, our screen. To parse briefly Goethe, only just translated into English or imminently to be translated as Turner paints. Color exists as a degree of darkness. The interaction of light and dark are essential for the visuocentric formulation or formation of nature. Light is simply a means through which darkness is always already, and its variant colors can be perceived. Light is the medium of exposure, but also the medium which scumbles the message. Nature is dark, inimical to light, yet only observable through its invisible medium. But light and color, Goethe's theory the morning after the deluge, Moses writing the book of Genesis, as a square with its non-dark finish, works against this. We cannot take white to simply be pigmentally representational of light, as it basically obscures the figures represented. But without its screening, its obscuring, we do not have the layering of narratives that allow the painter to create conceptual critique. We do not gain any movement or finish in the work. The vernissage and its effect finish each of these narratives, Goethe, God, Moses, and finish them off, represent them together, a slant, made obscure in the framing of the work through the figure of the artist, or the framing of the work, literally, toute courte, as something which accedes to the dimensionality of the frame, whose surface, screen, is not significant. Again, reason why there are no slides. Note how the pixel approaches the possibility of shadow in the work, because it just makes it the same as pigment would be, how this renders indistinguishable its dimensionality or its painterly and plastic aspects. Lead-based white. It's one of the oldest pigments. Go another slide. Which carries with it connotations with the possibilities of representation across eras, across continents. Lead, zinc, easy to mine, easy to develop into something of a paste in combination with other ingredients which are more or less natural, synthesizing the natural into the synthetic. So successful in its natural form that it is not until the industrial synthetic atomic stages of the scientific revolution, the 19th century, that there is in titanium whites a non-lead based, non-kind of poisonous alternative that stands up to the force of tension held by a lead-based white. But long before that, we have stopped using it as makeup. Lead, natural, denatures us in its application to the face. Lead denaturing mammalian nature, nature and application to nature denatures, and the cracks show up due to apparent misapplication. Lead, white take on different colors dependent on the quality of what is cut through, particularly vis-a-vis the oil base. So different oils make the white different. So our second square, which you can barely see here, it sits on top of the toner. A square on square, so Maleevich's white on white square. The oil base we see here matters, so two different whites in oil. As what is presented are the different possibilities of white, cast slantways, the one square sitting aslant to the other. The choreography uses the possibility of the square and an intent internal calling towards the rotational possibility of the square. This is not like Turner's sort of easy proto-vorticist circular, which allows for the frame of the square dimensions to be attended to with some geometric neatness. Yet the paintings share this kind of critical dimension. The use of the square as a critical dimension. And the stuckness, the square is stuck in Maleevich in its movement. We're stuck, this square, in the Vernissage, drawing attention to itself as such. The white on white is it an intent towards pentimento, the changing of the artist's mind, the cover up in paint, white covers up white, the natural process of aesthetic change, an unnatural mode of the painterly touch up, the changing of mood, of mode. Maybe, not yet. Lead-based white. The white, then, in painting across cultures up to a certain period that is consistently used, if we do not for now accede to the principle of the blank, so-called non-painted space of the page being void or light, as in many Chinese scroll paintings, there's just sort of non-painted space. Or, for instance, in the light-based medium of the cyanotypes, washout spaces, where therefore the white of the material is held in tension with that of the paint that kind of remains, and its implication of shadow in its very material nature, before we even reach the question of pigment. The white then as a form of light as white that is necessary to give the impression through matter and pigment of the idea of light, of space, as well as of white objects and white objecting. It provides the appearance of nature through the mimesis of light, as it were, in Turner. The final square, or this most famous void painting, needs no introduction, I hope, although yeah, we can see its cracks, is almost so much reproduced that we no longer see it anymore. The being of this square seen through its not being seen is perhaps one of its points. The work in primary install and in the kind of the Tate redo of the primary install was slantways to the 90-degree corner of the room, that position of the kind of the icon position, pushing even further the way that the square refuses the classical facts of painterly nature or classical naturalism in its representation. And it's now shown for the most part face on rather than slantways. It all cracks up. We cannot but see the cracks in the paint. In this layering, we see through the cracks. The printer actually prints only the black, not the cracks. It's just a normal inkjet. As with Turner, it prints not the vernissage, only the pigment below it. So that's one of the things about the digital translation. So in the layering, we see through the cracks to the squares we have attended to before. These are perhaps painting's most famous cracks, now carefully preserved, and have occurred in series, the kind of before, a cross comparison of cracking up, as it were. This is the demonstration that certain pigment possibilities have shorter lifespans, and that this messes with the stasis of any given representation, that every form has its own denaturing inbuilt through aspects held unnaturally, naturally in force, where force or tension in some ways are a mode which exceeds to the material, and therefore to a different register of nature represented. This is a larger question for older modes. And this is an aside, I suppose. Roman Antrobus has an extraordinary poem about darker matter in painting and what this has meant for the longevity of representation of black bodies in paint. The poem is called Plantation Paint, which is a response to the dynamics of restoration of the 19th century painter John Antrobus's Plantation Burial. Again, in this, the cracks expose a tension far greater than what they materially hold in tension, and for the figuration within. Here, that very temporality of figurative non-figuration appears present, pentimento, impenitently, as the recent, perhaps controversial analysis of the painting demonstrates. The black square occurs fast painted over the top of the more conventional color-pigmented cubist futurist composition. The cracks do not show us this necessarily. Again, the white occludes the white of the cracks, but demonstrates something of the nature of the finish itself, that some pigments hold tension differently from others in a false display of layering, whose real layering only underlines the necessarily false pentimento that the crack spacing gives rise to in the viewer's self-conditioned archaeological imaginary, their kind of Schillerian curiosity about the nature of the work of art. White here also gutters, so there's a white gutter to the square. That which is not pigment, which is nevertheless pigment, is in strange complicity with and in contradistinction to the pigment white of Turner's Vernissage. White, the spaces which demonstrate the blackness of the black, and the white pigment shows the different tensions held in the pigments represented in their material and symbolic modes. Turner's vanishing method remains a mode of reading the disappearing frame, of seeing the dimensionality of the screen. In Turner, a convexity, right, the boss-shaped lump of the sun. In Malevich here, a concavity, the crack spacing, and thereby the work of the work otherwise obscured or flattened by our face on viewing. We realize the different matters at play here, material, symbolic, material, setting aside the recent controversy over the pencil inscription discovered in the same analysis for Malevich, that also found the kind of the processual colored layer, or should it be the first layer, the staging and reality of pentimento does something to how the concept of the work in the case of this work operates. It's much like, in a sense, the analysis of Quaitman that exposed the significant found portrait of Luther that backs the infamous Angulus Novus of Clay, though there the apparent pentimento is much more impenitent, much more vulgarly obvious in its conceptual mode or move. The white gutter, returning to the black square, exposes the deframing and reframing of the textual dimensionality, text, that is the work's force of nature. So the conservator's nightmare, right? The artwork whose time of life in stasis is undermined by the work's inbuilt self-denaturing process. I said white gutters. We see that gutter white in the lead white around the black square. It's frame that isn't the frame. This is part in material conceptual commentary of the work's work, and calls also to a form we've engaged with partly, in which the gutter is a mode of so-called finishing, which nevertheless also holds material predicate, a formative aspect that is another of our vernissage questions under the auspices of the quest or question of the rhetoric of the disappearing frame or finish, but its nevertheless continued presence. Recall, perhaps as context for this, the earlier reference to Stéphane Mallarmé. This momentarily allows us to remain in a period sort of with Malevich, but of course we're moving towards the 21st century through these series of digressions. And this goal, some form of titular elucidation, recondensing, decondensation. But this is also kind of an important reframing of this frame. Recall the infamous white blanks, blanc, that not only await inscription, but importantly signify. This is, of course, fodder to all sorts of readings of the Séménon Cusizé, a further digression that, but if we had world enough for time, we would make. The innovation of expression of the expressive page, the dissolution formation of the figure of the master, the wreck, the feather, the cliché clash of modernity between the technological and the human, their varying, colliding counts and accountings. But this, and here note, this is a minor yet important point. This attention to the page extends for Mallarmé to not only the gutters of the page, gutters which are that important aspect for print technology, that which separates unprinted pages from the set of the pages for type, etc., so that which they are that which frames type as if pictorially visible, perhaps, And so we might return to the rhetoric of the conditioning finish of classical nature art in its dimensionality, portrait landscape, and to the mobilization, and kind of move forward to the mobilization of the gutter as significant in comics art. But attention extending from Mallarmé to the performance of these gutters, like the performance of the vernissage, the performance of the finishing. In his obsessive notes for the book project, the demand here, much as the demand of the squares we have attended to have made for the exposure of the dimensionality of the framework of the work, is to show through practice also the accessions we make, the way that we screen out the frame or finish of the page. The gutters of the book, in the notes for the book, demand precise dimensions, such dimensions as the turning of the page, which is the exposure of the relationship between finish and dimensionality, is at once facilitated and made strange. The rhythmic nature of the book operates in part in the rhythm of the work, and in part through the rhythm of the form itself. The twofold nature allows for the conceptual interrogation of the question of the frame, and thus the question of nature and its finish itself, how we see and interact with what we think we see. Standing sideways to the canvas, Gilbert wrote of Turner's Vernissage of Regulars. I saw that the sun was a lump of white standing out like a boss on a sheet. The painting, in its vernissage, its finishing, which simultaneously enacts and calls to attention the matter of the finish of the work and the various forces, material, symbolic, it holds in tension, is likened by Gilbert to a shield's boss. The white scumble screen, the circular nature of a painting's vortex, the momentum, the implication, because after all, it is nevertheless a medium of representation about which Gilbert writes, that similitude is layered on top of similitude, that aspects of the work's force call out for more layering, the very tenor of the likening here, a defensive offensive weapon, the shield's boss, cognate with the force and speed of Turner's finishing work, crafted in particular, which is also a work of art. The lead white nub becomes brassy, metallic, bossing. Cannot but recall, and forgive me a poetic skip here, the other hypercanonical cross-culture nature screen shield, the shield of Achilles. The question of a layering of representation created within a dimensional reflective medium, the dual purpose of this particular apocryphal mythic object, offense, defense, contemplation, conceptualization. The shield, burnished, undergoes in its finishing towards use a vernissage. Such a vernissage is, in an extra narrative sense, which is necessary here, the finish, of course, of the literary work in which its form is exposed, described, or speaks out, ekphysine, from. This finish, a mimicry of the play of light on hammered metallic structure, a series of gutters or outlines between sections of the representation on the shield, tell or signify, allowing for a different kind of rhythm to the circular rhythm implied by the process of nature explicitly represented in the circle of the shield. The gutters betray the representation. The light betrays the matter. The boss, the use by the very apparently exceptional human nature, the warrior, Achilles, it articulates commentary upon. The stages of the original Homeric ekphrasis betray the guttering between sections. The light effects of the embossed guttering and central boss frame the double use of the work, but we only see this if we look, guided by the other dimension of the work, aslant. Its finish also betrays its work, its lack of finish through its mobilization of the work of the work. It screens itself through art or through purpose. Its shine or finish betray and occlude the labor of the work in its making, of the work in its use. It is the matrilineal untongued mother's gift transposed into matter by an exile, Thetis, Hephaestus, fashioned for the untongued, untimely son, Achilles, whose deed of the gift of his own armor to someone else, precipitated the need unseen for the body again to be shielded, finished from itself and the forces mobilized against it by the excess of hollow interiority or rage the body possesses. The finish or shine of the shield indeed offensively projects back into its only front-facing viewer light and themselves reflected, act less as a mirror, but more as an interlocutive force. But in such a form, indeed, with all effects of vernissage, we must attend to the metatheatic force at play here. There, then, is sort of the glimmer of Foucault's too dark, too light mirror, the metathesis of visibility. The interior content, as with our other squares, circles, is in itself anachronic, And its finish, its gutters, exposes this, but only if we look for the work of the work. It wrenches the observant mind in many possible directions whilst retaining the whole. Donald Davies' articulate energy, in a sense. What keeps it together, all together, can seem indeed to be that which drives it ultimately apart. Its finish is its finish. And I'm looking at the clock now on the subject of finish. Every time I say finish, I look at the clock. And I think we might be running out of time. So the next step of digression here was, as I initially promised in my notes to the curatorial program, to take up Auden's Shield of Achilles, which I'm going to wave under the document camera, the poem in particular, and the finishing of the poem and the volume more generally in its central section, In Sunshine and Shade, the manner in which Auden very clearly mobilizes through this volume a non-mimetic, non-ekphrastic modality in which our naturalization of a sense of simultaneous sentimental separation from a naive incorporation with, and yeah, Schiller haunts this significantly, nature, which is not quite an idea, the Shield of Achilles of Auden, the relation of the exposure of expectation and of labor, the exposure of labor, which is a ground to the real of the work, which disappoints even, or perhaps especially in the face of art, which precipitates the maternal cry of dismay of Thetis, which also shows up on the finish, which also shows up the finish, not on the finish, or frame that in other, let's say, Western traditions occludes through vernissage through itself. The rhythmic movement between, in the poem, The Shield of Achilles, stanzas and perceptions, and I'm massively condensing here, and I apologize for this, but I'm sure that I'm always happy to discuss Auden. So if Auden comes up in questions, let's go for it. The rhythmic movement between stanzas and perceptions allows Auden, in this poem in particular, to demonstrate this slantways gaze, the dimensional modulation, the unfiguring of the figure, the ungrounding of the ground. And all of this happens with or through the focalization, not wholesale, through Thetis aslant. She looks over his shoulder, the labourer, Hephaestus, and looks at what is being wrought in increasing dismay. The framing of the work hovers in the points, the gutters, which show up the relations between rhythms, perspectives, stanzas, timescales. None of this is new, which held in tension show up through force, the frame, the labour of the continued engagement with the idea of nature, the second and second nature, but also show up. Auden is, of course, writing in the 1950s, so we're moving towards our unframed framed now. The dependence by now built up on the vanishing through habits of perception of the vernissage or finish or frame or screen. The fact that habit builds up a very clear ability to not see, whilst depending on the finish of the frame of the work or the work of the work. So one final digression or move, and I apologize for running on, which is through the cracks and with the idea of surface, the light wave play on various surfaces that exposes the possibilities of bosses or cracks to articulate material tensions, violences, formative voices. And I'd like us then to come back full circle or square to the poem. But let's just be brief. So I'm going to kind of chop out willfully various paragraphs as I go. Consider the installation of so-called unmediated nature. Let's use, and I threatened this to the team on the curatorial development program, so let's just go with it. Ice Wash by Oliver Eliasson. The work's work was, at the most basic level, one of show and tell deixis framed by studio gallery context. Large chunks of ice were imported and left to melt in two of Europe's art capitals, London and Paris, by some of the most infamous gallery spaces. The message? Well, we are all polar bears on the icebergs, perhaps. The work was, in a sense, an act of bringing of the mountain to Muhammad, a similar exercise in futility, ultimately, which may well have been the point of the work, the sentimentalist throwing up the hands in the face of a perceived impasse, the kind of the nature problem of the 21st century, and going on to create further evidence, further sentiment for this. Oh no, we can see it again, we're again on the iceberg. Rather than, so Muhammad in the mountain, rather than the foolish old man who removes the mountain, the Chinese parable, although both parables induce effective interaction and second order thought, only one, the latter, exposes and tells of the exposure of labor and is conventionally also read as a call to collective action against immaterial forces, to look to see how in material forms they are in fact exposed, so how the work of the work can be shown. The foolishness of the work of the work sometimes. But to the mountain-moving spectacle of ice watch, the work's finish was its emplacement, Paris, London, pavement. Its screen, the various aesthetic modalities of nature interaction. Its immediate self-viability calling to multiple insta-squares. Right? The interactions with the work demanded individuals to become individuals, to frame it, these ice blocks, the something that has been quite literally dragged and dropped onto the pavement, right? A literalization of the drag and drop action we use on a day-to-day basis on our computer screens. Our secondary meaning of the gutter, which we have not yet touched on, which is the control mechanism for water flow, what frames our streets, what we again forget to see, the sanitation labor of any given space, is here. The work, the ice, gutters itself, disappears into the gutter. The work shields itself too, screens itself. The ice is a reflective medium, more than bronze, a medium of cracks, more than the black square. The frame, non-frame, shows us here, countervalent, the apparent making real of nature, the eco-art method, rather the thinking nothing, the annihilating of any form of nature through the mobilization of the viewer. They're making complicit through the frame, finish, screen of the work, or your telephone, made invisible. The screen is made invisible, you put it in your pocket. And through the work's demand for the potential options of regression to the naive or the sentimental. The work of the work becomes spectacle. The non-human drone footage zoom, which is a rhetoric born from literary speculative worlding, note the sky-skimming passages, for instance, of Rachel Carson's Under Sea Wind, to which we have become habituated through so many opening credit sequences for nature viewing, real and imagining. Note the opening sequences of the majority of nature documentary programs. So the real work of the work, import, install, gutter, form, is self-invisibilizing. The overall effect, a functional indifference to this work, a kind of an accession to the effect of the spectacle, because all that is left there is work. There is no longer nature. The ice is denatured. Its time always already gone. And there's no longer art, even as the frame, what frame we give it persists in countervalence to this, but the frame itself becomes invisibilized. And if this indifference persists, it is also persistent as an occlusion. If not that, then, with nature, with art gone, and only work remaining, and the processes of the work's invisibilization, the only material presence which nevertheless gutters, then perhaps what we have left is horror. Take off for a moment the screen, the protective shield, finish, boss, spectacle, mediative principle, scumball. Think now to the second aspect of the joke, or is it, of the guiding principle of the overall Bicart Warehouse series, the screaming, and the overall overarching curatorial principles at play. What then is that, if not the fact of the varnish, a history of an inability to notice the heavy materials of laborious processes of invisibilization, so-called whiteouts, even when they are noted, placed in relief, made convex, concave, shadowed, boss, gutter, craquelure. Such a so-called relief becomes a mode of finish, what we see through, which becomes through habit, invisibilized, see-through. The mark of the 21st Vernissage is its presence in an immaterial, labor-intensive mode. The injunction of the frame, which is seen through, is one which demands a wrong return, for which there are two double options. The naive, lick the ice, finger the cracks, get lost in the true nature of art. And the sentimental, oh, but the ice is here and is yet distance. Beware in the sentimental mode, the orientalizing process, the varnish veil at play. Or, oh, the time of art is akin and yet so different to my own mortality. Ah, but what it must have been at the dawn of the 19th century to paint. Ah, it is I, mea culpa, not art, who are wrong, bad, engaging in a fetishistic disavowing avowal, a reinstating of a naive subject, and thus the loop, which does not allow us a recourse to a calm classicism either of this process, these two wrongs seen slantways, which can demonstrate something else. Yes, the fact of the frame, the finish of the nature of the work made art. Again, this is a sentence whose components sit in replaceable order with each other, which necessarily demands your interactive, anamnetic, philological, conceptual work to expose through such work the work of the work. And so it has to look like something if it has physical form. So the width. And so what gives now as the weight of paint cracks your canvas insufficiently stretched, print, prime, preened, are you ready yet, etc. And can only stand aghast. Apart from the process, watch a double crackle. Some potters would cherish this half-praised light was never so effective at tight-fisted illumination as now, although we all know a milder crackle may be accidental, a product perhaps of too fast cooling off, as it all cracks up. The months or years or tears, and of course it is possible to equate all this. The symbols show us elastic proportions, ratio, a difference in strain between sub and pictorial layers to measure our crack up thus or similarly. Yeung. And from below comes the seismic shift. We're lucky it's not landscape, which can be caused only by too much crap piled above your gaudy daubs and perhaps drifting old age. And what a to-do. As I weep, you ignore, pound the floor, pace, brush over the cracks, crack brushes over your one good knee, crying out in pain, and for crap's sake, begin what happens next by stuffing the canvas with whatever you can find, and dirt, dust. The floor has never been so clean. Crumbs, dead leaves, marzipan, cigarette ash, broken sherds of cups, dog hair, my hair, that was never a dog, spit twice or more, wrath, skin, it all goes in. And as a final joke, on jest of a master, you drag out the oldest tin of primer you can find and slap it on in full. An act of vernissage reversal, if you will, revenge best served with nary a pang, pure impentimento, and it is a white square. Taut masterpiece, pieces tight, not from many years of stretch, but my short hours of tension, your short hours of rage or sleep, a crackpot crackler or conservator's nightmare, and of course, sells for millions a song, your white outmidden or bleakest of mares. It's all sorts hanging all out in between shades of white, just waiting, bleached of purpose, till it's time to go dirty, cracking up all over again. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heather, for this really fantastic presentation. A lot of images have been really popping up into my head, and also I was just thinking of when you started your presentation about this image of Prophet Mustafa, a character in Gibran Khalil Gibran's poetic essays, which was published in the 80s, and it has like this, the image of Mustafa, who was like exiled for 12 years outside of his city, and the image of Mustafa has like, now I'm just like thinking about it, that has like a little bit of cracks, but also this idea of the frame that has been, you know, covering his face, as much as Gibran in the drawing didn't want to kind of create this shaping or framing. At the end of the day, it's still kind of contained within this drawing that is within this frame. With this note, I would think maybe perhaps we have a 5 minutes break, and then we can return. And by that time, I think some of us would gather our thoughts and start the conversation and discussion.
Amazing. Yeah.
All right. So see you in 5 minutes. I know a lot of us are in different places, but let's count it 5 minutes from now. See you soon. All right, welcome back, everyone.
Yeah, I never know how to respond with this, like the online sort of niceties of muting and unmuting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Welcome back, everyone else.
I mean, we've kind of like also like disappeared into this black void and came back as well. Yeah, Heather, thank you again for your presentation and for this poetic yet critical descreening storytelling approach. At the beginning of your presentation or your lecture, you set a stage for like almost at the beginning, two kind of screens. This image, this metaphor, and you mentioned, you know, Aristotle's, you know, concept of metaphor, and this metaphor of a screen that we are looking from or at, of this, of your digital representation or presentation, but also another kind of screen, and this other kind of screen has this unlimited spatial dimension that keeps mimicking, copying, freezing images of nature or landscape. And here, this mode of layering that you mentioned, and also like was evident throughout your lecture, through the different references, through the different also like images that appeared and also like layered across. Why it's important to unlayer these images or frames through metaphors as well. So the metaphor is also an image making tool as well. And be it like a language, be it like a physical manifestation of this, you know, representation or presentation. And yeah, I wonder like if you have any thoughts to share on that. This mode of layering and using also a metaphor as a tool to kind of like, perhaps my question would be is also to kind of like, let's say, to bring in why also image is important as well, and like if you like the vanishing of an image. I mean, on the like the idea of image is actually as important as kind of like, you know, sorry, I'm like a little bit sick today, but I think, yeah, my question would be like around this idea of and the importance of image making and also the curation of layering in terms of a mode into the vernissage, and or the opposite of you know, the technique itself that you have used and other artists kind of used in their books, but also like in a spatial dimension.
Yeah, I think there's a lot, Nina. Which is good, I think. But I will I'm trying to work out where to come in. I'm still also unpacking what you're saying previously about sort of the framing and the limitation function, right, of the still visible frame and the kind of implications of breaking the frame that you kind of mentioned just before the break, and this is the point at which kind of all sorts of pressure on language mean that language begins to unravel itself in any of the possibilities of answers given to the question. I suppose one of the things that's sort of unspoken and yet spoken, and I'm kind of happy that you picked up on the Aristotle that gets sort of changed or kind of reframed or deframed by Walter Benjamin in his kind of essay on translation, is that idea of translation and kind of the imperative of translation, and the way that I was sort of seeking to kind of form something, because of course we translate particularly and not only in language, and one of the kind of the funky things about translation are those shifts, those gaps kind of in between the modalities. And so as you know, and so for other viewers here, we're talking kind of particularly within a kind of curatorial development program. And so like thinking about the kind of the bringing to bear of the positioning of the work of art within a kind of a given delimitation of position. I suppose that always involves, from a curatorial perspective, as well as from kind of a maker's perspective, or from a curator as maker's perspective, that kind of very act of the translation imperative. So how to give forward something whose context has been sort of effectively kind of forcefully deracinated and yet re-racinated through a historicizing contextual process, and yet nevertheless sort of sits as something that has in itself its own sort of odd materiality and its kind of own series of either visuocentric or verbal or cultural contexts that it's bringing to bear. And so, the question about layering and the difficulty of layering is something that I think is always a problem, because the limits of curation are always the limits, like always about that kind of limit of layering, the limit of the book. And I realize I don't have the document camera on anymore, so I can't. The limit of the book as form are kind of the limits of its edges, its layers, but also this sort of the framing, the finish that we give these things are these kind of modes of accession, of these kind of threshold modes of accession and welcome, the threshold modes which are also the cracks within the translation process, right? And when it's a sort of a development program where we're sort of thinking through the possibility of nature, and these are conversations we've had in different ways kind of across the different weeks, and this question of what it is to kind of give up and give forth on the subject of the possibility of thinking about nature, these things become intensely, like oddly philological and material all at once, and therefore demand that that kind of question of translation in the most generous sense to kind of come forward. And that is absolutely cultural translation, and that those sort of big questions we've put pressure on, but also the translation of kind of the work of the work, that sort of the kind of invisibilization of processes, and taking kind of and kind of noticing those as modalities that we rely on, and then working out what to do about that. I remember kind of in a previous week, a long time ago, before kind of term took hold of me in its aggressive forms and formulations, the conversations about how we place stuff and where we place stuff, and how that sort of acknowledgement or non-acknowledgement of so-called eco-credentials has space or not space kind of within a gallery context as yet another frame on a frame on a frame, or an invisibilization of various frames in the kind of light of other frames. So I guess what I'm trying to do in this answer to you is to move between these questions of sort of metaphor and translation and frame, and think about that sort of the line that cuts through them all, which is this sort of odd scumbling, this kind of crack spacing, this vernissage, right, this other dimension in the way that we view. And viewing is taken, of course, metaphorically as well as in the literal sense. Yeah,
absolutely. And it makes me really have, like, you know, these also like the history of exhibition and exhibition making as well. And that's something that kind of like we picked up in terms of like not only like as exhibition makers, but also like as the whole kind of like entity and organization of that kind of builds in this frame, or like deframing within this limited space itself. And those modes of creating in terms of like occupying a space itself has also like a legacy of fixed notions and a language that also does not speak to also the works that are being, I wouldn't use the word screen, but displayed or seen. And that kind of creates this problematic ways, in the ways in which the metaphor or the language itself has already been hijacked, you know, by this mode. And this is why I feel like your presentation is very important. I mean, you're like also like the modes and the the speed and low speed and the textures of what we have, what you have, like the journey that you have taken us today in terms of like, it creates this interesting, let's say, mode that is codependence on your kind of tools that you are presenting, but at the same time, it's kind of like it's playing around the idea of language itself and how do we kind of like we need to deframe the language. So for now, I'm going to open the floor for any of the participants to ask questions. And Rohit has generously offered to also support in taking some of these questions with me, given my current condition. So thank you, Rohit, for that.
Of course. Do you want to? I'm on the YouTube, so there's actually one from the YouTube. Then we can come back to the Zoom. Would you like me to read this aloud? Mina, you've done a heroic job as well. So thank you.
Thank you. That would be great, actually.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. And Heather, thank you so much. That was great. I'll hop to YouTube and then we can maybe divide, and you can see what our Zoom participants are up to after that, if you're feeling okay. So this is a question from Reem Abbas. And
hello,
Reem. I wish, okay. So unfortunately, Reem is not able to unmute, I don't think, because of the YouTube. She's on the YouTube, but she's saying, I'm just thinking about vernissage, with and in poetry or within poetry, and I'm wondering a couple of things. So only reading and rereading can allow insights. Is this a question? This is a question beyond the screen of the finished work, right? Or is insights the right word here? Only reading and rereading can allow some sort of insight, maybe in quotation marks, beyond the screen of the finished work, right? And then Reem goes on to ask, in terms of my own academic process, it seems that reading around the text, both through its and one's own affinities and beyond them, whilst attempting to tune into language's material histories, is a way of doing this kind of reading. I'm reading as Reem was typing, so I'm not doing justice to her question comment, right? So can I read that for you again, Heather? Because I didn't do great with that. So Reem's thinking about vernissage with and in poetry and wondering a couple of things. I think she's asking, is it only reading and rereading that can allow insights beyond the screen of the finished work? And she's saying in terms of her own academic process, it seems that reading around the text, both through its and one's own affinities and beyond them, while attempting to tune into language's material histories, is a way of doing this type of reading, right? I think gaining this insight beyond the screen of the finished work. Maybe we can start there with Reem's question. There are a couple of others.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Reem. That's exciting. Yeah, this idea of I'm going to pick up various parts of it just very briefly. The reading around and through and with and out with kind of affinities, I think, is that sort of odd thing, kind of process which may seem profligate, but which actually becomes kind of a modality or a process-based form kind of encounter with a given work. Yeah, and I think in terms of the poetic kind of mode of page-based enunciation, so kind of it's already kind of double form, then and the way that it picks up metapoetically on the tools with which kind of encounter is forced or formed, certainly the sort of interaction and interrogation of the ground as well, like or the tenor and the vehicle kind of within that question, and then the sort of gap spacing between that gap spacing between can kind of veer off in sort of affinity with or without the work, with or without one's reading self. I think, yeah, certainly. I think basically my answer is just strong yes. But I feel that that's kind of not generous enough for the way in which kind of discourse is occurring. So I'm trying to work out kind of examples of that. I suppose would be looking at the kind of the restriction of the work itself. So this kind of coming back to the question of the gutter, and this is something for, I guess, early print media, but then kind of verging into kind of artist book and poetry object related formulations, but also across a war period, a question of how the significant aspect of the page is restricted by restrictions in trade, which change the ways that paper quality is made and therefore its coloration, but also restrictions in kind of paper quality itself. So those of us that deal with the poets of the particularly, I think the 40s know quite and the 50s know quite well what war standard paper feels like to deal with, and you feel the work quite astringently through the work, and the stuff is more bunched up, and so there is a different accession to the question of the significance of space in the work. The significance of space becomes something that is also heavily kind of demonstrative of a political conjuncture in which the work's production, not necessarily the work's composition, but the work's production in itself sits. So that kind of almost reuse value sensibility that you get in, that allows then the return to the question of the work itself, if we consider the poem as sort of poem text that's mobilized through our kind of active dynamic reading and reading of resonance, and therefore of kind of attention and temper within the work. That sort of then sits influenced by all of the stuff that we know is there through, for instance, the use of war standards paper, and therefore the bunching of the page, and therefore the kind of certain accession to an amount of printing that can or cannot be made given economic restrictions and printing at a given time. And we can put some of that to a side in order to encounter the work proper, but also can use that knowledge of the conjuncture to get a sense of the tensions inherent in the work sitting within its kind of given conjunctural form. In a sense, that's a sort of material historicism, which is essential to a kind of modality of reading. But at the same time, it's a sort of, you can then see moments where that becomes a metapoetic register, where that then becomes a metaphorical habit, where therefore it becomes a habitus that becomes a form, that becomes something that's unthought, that becomes something that's invisible, that then becomes something that's difficult to shift, that then we can look back to and see kind of like various forms of origin point in kind of in, I guess, the sort of the way that matter can be formed and then looked at and framed. So that's in relation to poetry in particular, and to the kind of the poets in question, I suppose. And then, of course, there's the way that the artist will configure their own tools. And we talked earlier about kind of Turner and the kind of the absolutely precise slapdash in terms of a method of vernissage, but there's also that sort of sense that within the work, there's the way that the metapoetic register of the accession to the kind of idea of the tool will create another sense of logic within the work. So one could think of like Bunting's take, chisel and write, and what that means. One could think about kind of Heaney's, squat pen sitting in his hand, I'll write with it. One can think of various other ways in which the metaphorical absolutely condense within the acts of the very acts of poetic inscription, and then become self-ironized through kind of modes of print technology and the various economic demands of the circulation of the work. So in short, yeah, still hard, yes, to answer to reading this question. And I think I might just hand over to either Lina or Rohit to kind of move us on a wee bit. I'm conscious of the clock and the fact that I can digress. So please at any point aggressively mute me also.
Thank you, Heather, for answering the question. Do we have any more questions, Rohit, on YouTube?
YouTube we can not yet. So we have
because we have a couple of hands raised here. And
perfect. Let's go to those.
Really great. Sorry, Rikita, maybe perhaps I'll unmute you right now. Please go ahead.
Hello, Heather. Glad to see we're both black turtleneck twinsing today. That's pretty fun. But no, thank you so much. This is not going to be at all any sort of articulate question. I think I'm very much still, I don't know, floating in the various streams you've kind of opened up here. I also particularly enjoy the way that you play with words. So I think I might have been a bit self-indulgent in thinking about that rather than necessarily sort of conceptual convergences. But I guess I've kind of been thinking, I mean, you took us through sort of Turner, you know, a lot of paintings, Malevich, as well as Eliasson sculptures. And I guess it just kind of brought me in some sort of almost like obvious point, like to the moving image, especially within sort of artistic dimensions. And I'm kind of thinking about what the vernissage in a temporal sort of visual dimension might be. Is it the last frame? Is it the succession of vernissages? I guess this in some weird self-reflexive way kind of comes back to your presentation itself, because I was kind of seeing those layers and frames sort of moving and enfolding and unfolding sort of across one another and into one another. And so I guess I was just kind of thinking what happens to representation, especially in the context of representing the non-human in this sort of moving image medium. And I mean, a couple of films just sort of popped to mind, not really to do with non-human necessarily, but sort of Derek Jarman and Blue, also like James Benning and the end of, I guess, Nightfall, where it's kind of the single shot looking at the sunset and sort of ends with this, with darkness, essentially like a dark frame, right? So yeah, I'm just kind of thinking about what this might do to the sort of palimpsestic and layering aspects of your talk today. Yeah.
Thank you, Rita. Okay, I'm going to answer with like absolutely zero specialization in moving image technology or otherwise, but to kind of indicate something that I think is quite fascinating in that kind of idea of framing assumption. So we see the dimensions of the screen, and I think I was watching a movie recently that kind of came back to kind of a televisual set of dimensions, and the relief that gave to my eye was immense, right? Sort of we get used to the widening and widening of the landscape option of the screen. So that kind of idea of the sort of the distance between the sort of the monadic viewing self and its hyper visualized landscape dimension, horizontal kind of implication of nature within the fact of the screen. But then when you come back to sort of workers like Drummond who are working with a different image ratio, you have kind of a different sensibility that's sort of bringing it back in and sort of almost with that kind of squares non-functional function in terms of its aspect ratio, but is not quite. It's always just not portrait. So there's sort of that aspect. But the thing that I kind of really like is just the projection. So we're working with kind of a light projective medium, right? Onto a screen, and there's a absolutely different kind of dimensionality to that, where you have these kind of, well, I'm going to be old-fashioned about it and non-digital, and therefore we can call it German. But these sort of these celluloid kind of things that are cut, right? And you know the idea of the kind of the lost thing, the cutting room floor. But in a sense, that actually just the inherent plasticity and the kind of liquidity of that form that then kind of in light is cast as if on a screen, right? We can kind of move back to an Eliasson function, that sort of early cinematic thing. And so what one sees is never quite what one sees, and it's nevertheless precisely what one sees. And so in a sense, that layering is already happening just in the mode of projection. And so if you think of just a slide installation rather than a cinematic installation, and then kind of think about kind of a moving image thing. So it's not kind of a Muybridge like sort of self-contained role that kind of one looks round and around, but the kind of essential nature of the projective function of the cinematic work still provides that sort of slip or finish or that kind of that trip up, I think. I would have to think about that more, and I like that kind of idea, particularly if we're thinking about kind of installation in that sense as well, in a gallery space rather than a kind of a theatre space, and the ways that all of those have different sorts of framing accessions. So we nevertheless go to a movie theatre and we kind of think, okay, well, the one safe thing about a movie is, even though, you know, the train is going to come towards you and the whole crowd like of kind of early cinematic audiences cliché going to go, oh, we nevertheless know it's not going to break the proscenium arch. It's like a safe space. So film does this bizarrely, right? It kind of doesn't, it doesn't break. Something doesn't break, and yet therefore it breaks because it's already broken, because it's got a double, because of the nature of projection. So that kind of odd immaterial materiality is maybe something that calls to this idea of finish, right? The finish happens in the projection, which is that sort of dimensionalization of something that is actually flat. But I mean, in terms of cinema, just don't ever quote me on this. I know that this is being recorded for like a digital posterity, but at the same time, yeah, but it's certainly something, I think it's something really interesting that we can all talk about, because then there's the install of the sound as well, which comes at these cross dimensions actually to the work of the image, which is that sort of, again, that sort of double dimensionality that's doing something quite interesting when it's manipulated kind of knowingly, when you have a filmmaker who kind of manipulates it knowingly rather than calling on the always already accession to kind of facts, classical facts of framing of nature, whether it's human nature or nature, that we sort of have been inculcated with, in a sense, through the predominance of, I guess, heavily Western cinematic modes and art forms.
No, I don't think you're off at all, actually. But I was kind of thinking about like Juliana Bruno's, I think obviously her earlier work about sort of surface and screen of light within film itself and off film. And also I think her recent book, which just came out in maybe October, which is sort of atmospheres of projection, which I'm in the midst of reading. But yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Ritika, for the good question. Also, Heather. We have another question from Frank Ruda. So please go ahead. Yeah.
I just want, I mean, I was very fascinated by the working through you did of the entire title of the seminar series. I mean, you showed, I think, how we're always projecting, over projecting or under projecting, how when we're talking about nature, any kind of nature, right? I mean, it seems first we frame nature in a certain way, and then even the idea that we could get behind the screen or behind the frame and just see pure nature is already a projection. But then, therefore, it is not only, if I understood correctly, that there is behind the mask is another mask, is another mask, is another mask. That is not the only argument, because strangely, this dynamic of being uber-formed and under-formed, maybe one could say that, right? Nature is always we project, and we project even when we want to encounter it in its purity. But the move from one projection to the next projection does something. I mean, I was wondering that when Rohit read Reem's question, and I think that was the moment where you indicated that there is a certain horror involved. Horror involved, right? When we move from when we seem to move but are at the same time stuck in moving, right? Always from another projection to another projection. And I also have a stupid film question, where you would situate that. And sorry, because you know the end of Lars von Trier's Melancholia, right? Where the melancholic is sort of a hero and faces the destruction which comes from, right? Actually hits the screen, one could say, right? Is that linked to? Could that be linked to the idea of the crack that you, right? I mean, because you were indicating that there's a cracking up going on. It's not simply a movement and stuckness in movement. Everything is a projection, and the projection, even under projecting, is projecting. And that horrifies us. And this is why we repeat. But there's also a different mode of repeating. There's a different mode. I mean, Freud would call that working through, right? That's somehow when something clicks and it stops, right? When something for a moment stops, when Like Lacan says, there's cause when it stops working. Right, and it was that is a vernissage element, maybe. Is that going in the right direction?
I'm trying to work out where the question is. Apart from the question about the direction of the comment.
Good at raising that up, sorry.
But I can sort of associate. Yeah, to sort of bring in some of Rita's points, some of Reem's points, and the kind of point about Lars von Trier's melancholia, which kind of is heavily, I suppose, cinematic in its modality. So the claim for the kind of the total artwork sort of weirdly obliviates itself, even though it kind of brings Wagner to bear, right? And in the way that work works. And interestingly, that sort of getting stuck in nature is sort of part of the process that's shown on the screen, right? That sort of the kind of the two things kind of colliding, and the body colliding with the earth, and the kind of the multiple kind of modes of the possibility of non-movement. But yeah, so the film itself, its demonstration of tension, I think, and the attention that we fail to pay attention in kind of a recourse to kind of the idea and the ideology that kind of the fact of narrative, and whether that's perspectival narrative or linear narrative, asks us to accede to. I suppose that's where this sits, this idea of the crack, not as a stasis, but as a stasis, as a different form of holding intention or force. I wouldn't go so far as to say scissoring, sundering, but I would kind of maybe call to that in what you sort of say, the move from mode of projection to projection, that almost kind of moving of, like, one could say parallaxing, right? The one eye, the other eye, the one eye, the other eye. And I just realized I'm kind of being recorded squinting to demonstrate. But the movement from those modes, and then the kind of the self-conscious looping of those modes, but then the utilization of those modes, and the kind of the production of kind of habit within our accession to those modes, is sort of this macro structure that can lend itself to kind of a formal stasis that kind of absolutely obliviates the fact of the labor that goes into each of these moments of potential kind of projective unstuckingness. But yeah, horror, therefore, yeah. And I don't think I think I'll kind of pass the buck to you in terms of the structures, the potential possible structures of horror. There's a sort of a digression, like in one of my digressions, that I wanted to make vis-a-vis the Auden, which we did not make, which obviously the Shield of Achilles is kind of a site of absolute horror, right? In so many ways, but particularly in the way that Auden recasts this, in the horror at the kind of the ironic indifference of even the possibility of the figuring of the mother and nature, and they kind of weirdly do this kind of waggle dance of kind of elision and sundering throughout that whole volume. In my reading, but that all of this is sort of based around the kind of the projective and non-projective dimensions of the shield, because the function of the shield to protect is precisely where we don't see the thing that is important for the aesthetic ekphrasis of the shield, and so the shield's function has that sort of non-seeing seeing thing that goes on that could seem like a functional stasis, but means that it's kind of bipartite force that's held in tension, necessarily kind of the one kind of issue, it like means that we sort of move from the one projection to the other projection to kind of to recognize kind of the full nature of the force, that sort of horrible 360 sense that the cinematic modality, I suppose, attempts through different mobilizations to give, but nevertheless kind of in its unbreaking only calls to attention the fact that its brokenness is kind of unidimensional in a sense, is in the cut, and whether that's a sonic cut or a visual cut, or the way that those things kind of act in counterpoint to each other. I don't think that's answered the question.
I think it did. Thank you.
Rico, you can go ahead.
Hi, thanks. So really fascinating taking apart of the system of projections and screens and the way that whole mechanism operates. It was really interesting. But I noticed I think it was just once when you were talking about, you used the word veil. If that rings any bells? And I don't know whether you said veil or unveiling, or whether it was just veil or unveiling. But I wonder if you have any further thoughts about the relationship between the veil and the screen, in the sense that the screen has this ambiguous sense, right? Or not ambiguous, just this two senses of something projected onto, or something that screens off something. But a veil blocks something, but it doesn't, as I forget who the Greek writer was, as the Greek writer says, there doesn't have to be anything behind. The function of the veil is just to be a block. We tend to think that it's blocking something that's behind it, but there's no commitment to there being anything behind it. So I'm just wondering if there's anything in there that you have any comment about.
That's really interesting. It's interesting how that kind of has sort of an odd Derridean romantic force that is maybe I don't know. I would put it out to the feminists in the room, the question of the veil. But I would say that rather than but the veil kind of functionally, I think, kind of societally, is something that, in the same way as the shield. So if one thinks of the shield of Achilles as something that simultaneously fends off and allows for projection onto or into, and that kind of double structure of that shield and shielding, and of course one sees it in the language. So I probably said veil and unveiling. I wouldn't alter that, but I suppose the digital recording will tell. But that idea of protection in terms of that kind of surface, that varnish, that kind of stumble. So what one uses a varnish for is, in a sense, to protect, right, as well as to allow things to be seen through, is, I think, in this sense, a way in which the question of veiling can also occur. Veiling seen kind of in a mode like a shield is an invitation to kind of battle, right? Its boss is kind of projecting out. A veil, kind of an invitation to kind of an unveiling or a sundering, one could say, or to sort of an accession to a different kind of mode of being. But I would, I suppose the veil and the screen relations, but also the veil and nature relations, right? Because one kind of continually has this question kind of through various poetological romantic modalities across many of the Western languages of the veil of nature. And of course, there are representations of the allegorical figure of nature as woman unveiling herself. And so that problematic nature of the question of the veil, the question of the idea of what one then finds, and that kind of idea of nature's screen is certainly something that this is sort of drawing on and thinking through. What we find, and kind of Frank's got that kind of that sort of moment, Hegel, of course, going behind the veil or drawing aside the curtain, we only find what we put there ourselves. Yes, and so for kind of a romantic sensibility, we find a lady nature with kind of boots out. And otherwise, what do we find if we start considering again that question of the varnish, that sort of light effect, that sort of mediated force, that frame, that screen, that veil? Well, I suppose that's the question rather than the answer that the talk poses. But I think the veil certainly rhetorically sits, particularly, I think, within a kind of I suppose sort of decolonial feminist art historical modality of relooking again at the kind of the ways in which our frames collude with different ideas of nature as framed, would certainly sit within the various questions that the talk sort of raised in terms of this, in terms of questioning the forms of screening and therefore the kind of the system of the screen.
Can I just add to that? So I'm just thinking as you're talking. So for the Turner works, veil fits as quite a good description when you're trying to work out what it is that he's doing. It feels like there are veils there rather more than screens, right? So I don't think I've seen anyone describing Turner's work as having, you know, this screen, something screeny about it, but something veiled, these kind of veils and mists. That really fits with Turner quite nicely. So I just wanted to add that. I think that really fits with what you're saying in terms of how nature relates to veils in this particular romantic sensibility. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Yeah, that sort of romantic orientalist problematic mode that Rediker also kind of brings up there. And I think that idea of vernissage is the sort of median point. So the kind of the finishing, the sort of which is at the same time the exposure. The protection exposure of the act of vernissage, the sort of bringing together in corporeal forms to observe the exposure of the work of art in party mode, and the occlusion of the labor behind the work of art. And I think that's the way that kind of Turner's kind of active vernissage principles, which is a sort of taking out the real scaffolding and putting in the performance of the scaffolding, to kind of use a creative writing idea, in order to occupy space and to demonstrate the way that the space of labor must necessarily politically be occupied, is that way of moving with still this kind of idea and ideology of the veil, but to break the kind of ideological nations, these orientalizing nations, and to think through again what these kind of the consequences of these veilings, these screenings, these varnishings are or may be. Yeah, so thanks, Vico. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks.
All right. As we're about to conclude our 2-hour session, we will have the last question from Rohit.
Yeah, I promise I'm not being greedy either. The YouTube is okay. Although I've copied and pasted Dreams, some really interesting comments I could send to you other independently. It seems like you both are also familiar with one another, so that can happen. But thank you. That was a great talk. I focused. I got my time of focus today. Very pleasurably. So I really appreciate that a lot. Selfishly, I think I'm going to sort of repeat in condensed form a lot of what maybe Rico, Frank, Whitaker, Reem, and Lena have asked you, but so forgive me if it's too repetitive. I was wondering, so the crack, right, like which runs through the talk, also for me was like a very, very important. I kept thinking of Fitzgerald's The Crack Up, and a very, very, very important, sort of moment that I thought sort of was that Ariadne's thread throughout the talk, at least in my ears. And I wanted to know whether you thought that there was something ontological about the crack, right? Like and this goes to horror, like just the notion of, I was thinking of like being a child. I remember watching some really, really terrible V.C. Andrews like made horror film Flowers in the Attic when I was like 4. My sisters would watch it. It was like a horrible horror film, but it wasn't even like a good horror film, but it was quite scary. Or like that Joan Crawford Mommy Dearest, the one that I was terrified by this, but I was very scared of horror movies, and I would like cover my eyes as a child. I was a coward, and but at the same time I would still want to see, like, so there was sort of, there's like there's it's so beyond like to veil or not to veil, to undress or to dress, right? There seems to be just maybe an ontological crack in the veil itself, right? In the vernissage or the finishing, the frame, all layers, right? So this avoids sort of maybe the relativist problem of that Reem. I don't think she was posing it as a problem, but as a question. And then Frank let's bring this up of the projection of the projection of the projection, this infinite regress of projections, which I think you addressed perfectly. But this notion of there's always already a crack in every veil, and it's precisely that parallax view that you were nicely squinting with for us. That is the methodological approach to dealing with every layer of the screen, right? With every layer of the screen. So that's sort of it. If that made any sense, Heather. But I just want to say thank you so much again for a brilliant talk.
Thank you, Rohit. Yeah, it's nice of you to bring it back to horror, the thing that I was trying really hard to like eschew, and yet it seemed the inevitable conclusion of the talk, or kind of at least the sort of performative aesthetics of the possibility of horror, kind of meeting kind of a sort of odd reality in the encounter with the kind of the framing of the frame, and that kind of that odd like non-mask the mask, but certainly the peering through the eye holes. Is there something ontological about the crack or crack up? I think there is something ontological about the gap between the crack and the crack up. And I can make it cute like that because we're bang on 4 o'clock. And the sort of the thread of the crack, you talked about Ariadne's thread, so I would question the kind of the weaving metaphor also that we haven't talked about in terms of that. But I think certainly the kind of the compulsion that kind of, I suppose, coming from a literary critical pedagogical perspective to kind of to encounter and yet not to encounter that idea of like looking through the hand at the thing that you don't know is there, the kind of the odd projected assumption of nothing rather than the projection of the projection, is certainly something that I think in the task of the question or questioning the question of nature and its relation to art and the curation of nature and the kind of the procedural impulses that we have in the ways in which we do that on a quotidian basis as well as in a kind of curatorial conceptual way, that like being prepared to encounter that kind of that opening where, I mean, for me, it's that idea of the work, right? The sort of the invisible labor force kind of within the work that has been mobilized in order to produce the tensions that are present within the work, that are engaging and yet occluded in the vernissage effects of the work, which nevertheless demonstrate them. That is the sort of horror in the sense. And I know that we've run out of time, so I will, yeah.
Super. Thank you so
Heather.
much. As we reach our end of our session today, I want to thank you, Heather, again for this really brilliant presentation. And I know that I will continue to discuss these, thoughts, and also like this, almost like a methodology that kind of runs through your work. And yeah, I look forward to having that. Soon. I want to thank everyone who contributed into the chat, and yeah, thanks a lot, everyone. And I wish you a wonderful night or evening. Yeah, we'll see you soon. Ciao.
Thank you, Lena. Thank you, Heather, so much. Thank you, Lena, very much. It was great.
Thank you.
You sung your suppers, both of you. So thank you. We'll see you soon, everyone, for our final talk in 2 weeks with Frank Hood.